Hey guys, welcome back to History Revision Success. So in today's video, I'm going to be going through one of the, bullet points in the advanced information, and that's about the racial state. Now, I'm going to focus on kind of a sub-question of that bullet point, and I'm going to be talking about how far there was a clear and consistent policy with Hitler and the Nazis' racial policy and racial approach to Germany. How far was there a plan? Now, I think this is one of the obvious questions that you could be asked on this topic. It's one of the questions very widely debated in the historiography. So therefore, I think there's every reason to have your answers cemented to really understand what you'd want to say if you got this question. Now, I'm also running a specific lecture on this specific topic. In this video, I'm going to be giving you all the overarching conclusions. I'm not really going to run through the evidence and how you'd bulk the essay out. If you want more information on this, do follow and wait till the end of the video to hear how you can sign up for that lecture, following the link below to my website and then getting in contact with me in order to get your place sorted. So the racial state. Now, as I said, this is the question I'm going to be looking at and focusing on. How far was there a clear and consistent policy or goal? Within this topic, I think there are many other questions you could be asked. So you do need to also think about these other questions. I'm not going to run through these in this video. If you would like more videos on this, do comment, do like the video, do let me know, but also remember that lecture where you can find out the answers to these there. Now, moving on. So one of the first things to get clear in your head is what happens with the timeline. So we're looking at change over time. Now, obviously, this is very difficult information to deal with. It's very emotive information. It's very sensitive information. So we're looking at it through a historical lens. We're looking at it to analyze it and look for changes. But of course, always be aware that what we're dealing with is people, lives, trauma. And so therefore, just make sure you're being very sensitive when you deal with this kind of information, these kind of topics. So I'm going to break down a timeline for you, which goes through what I believe to be the different segments of the time period in terms of change and where change takes place within German racial policy towards Jewish people. Now, I think 1933 to 1937 we can class as actually a period where there's a relatively passive approach. Obviously, it was still very difficult, very traumatizing, but it's very, very different at this point than it becomes much later on. It focuses, or racial policy very much focuses on legal exclusion, excluding Jewish people from legal benefits, from rights to citizenship, from jobs, things like that, and changing perceptions of other people in Germany, trying to shift and use propaganda to brainwash, to create hatred, to create anti-Semitism. At this point, however, livelihood, as in your life, your safety, was not so much threatened as it was much later on. Now, within this time period, you've got events such as the one-day boycott, you've got the Nuremberg laws, you've got the laws about employment, things like that. So that's all things to bear in mind. Now, this moves on to 1938, which I would class as a turning point in racial policy. That's because we have Kristallnacht. Now, Kristallnacht is different. Largely unplanned, spontaneous mass violence towards the Jewish community. It shows a point of escalation, a point of escalation, violence against the other, as propaganda has been trying to make out for the last 5 years, creating the other, using Volksgemeinschaft to exclude people from society and create those who are different, or as propaganda was portraying, not the case, obviously. Therefore, we see a point of violence. Policy is no longer about just legally excluding. It's now about causing harm, causing violence, removing from society a group of people. Now, I think another turning point comes in 1940, 1941, where we see the invasion of Eastern Europe, war in the East. Now, Hitler is very vocal about his difference in opinion over war in the East and war in the West. War in the West for him was a war of conquest. War in the East was a war of annihilation, a war of extermination. He had very strong racial views, not only just about Jews, but also about people from Poland, people from Eastern European countries. And he did view many different groups of people as inferior to himself. And therefore, the war takes a turn. From this point, we really see racial policy becoming entwined into war. The fact that he sends the Einsatzgruppen out after the first wave of fighters in the war against the USSR really exemplifies how he is tying in the outcome of racial policy to the outcome of war. And he begins to really prioritize it with that move. Now, obviously, it also kind of from 1939 with the invasion of Poland, but that also changes racial policy because he creates his dumping ground, as he calls it. And we have the creation of, the ghettos and things like that in that general government in Poland, where he can essentially put people he doesn't want in Germany, and he now has a place he can move them to. So I think we see another turning point in escalation. And that finally leads us to this last period of time. So obviously this goes on till 1945, but I guess the key decisions are really made up till about 1942, where we have the final solution and really that aim, that policy, which now is trying to achieve a Jew-free state. And that's what I would summarize the timeline as. Now, the question is, was this all planned and it was all meant to follow as it happened? And did that idea of the Jew-free state exist right from the very beginning? Or was this actually more to do with reactionary events? So this brings me to my two different approaches. Now, I know what I would argue, and I'll tell you that in a minute, but you really can go down this in two roads. You don't have to listen to me or follow me. This is my opinion. All these videos are my opinion. You could say, yes, he does have a clear plan. There's a clear escalation. It starts off as isolation and exclusion, and he works his way down, and eventually he reaches his end goal. But he had a plan with how he was going to get there. Or you could say, no, there was not a clear plan. Racial policy is actually reactive. It reacts to what's possible at the time, that actually there were priorities of the state. And when racial policy could benefit those priorities, it happened. When there was a chance for racial policy to be enacted because priorities had been dealt with now, it happened. But it was ad hoc, it was circumstantial. I think in order to fully understand your conclusion to the question, you do need to have some idea and some understanding of three key questions that are involved in understanding this approach. So the first one, was racial policy a priority to Hitler? And I think it's really important to get this clear. Now, there's obviously years and years of anti-Semitic rhetoric. We know how Hitler feels about that community of people. He's very vocal about that, as he is about other groups of people he doesn't view as being, racially, socially superior to others. He's very, very honest, I guess, about that in his writings, in his speeches. He uses it very vehemently in his kind of 1932 election campaign. He writes about it very openly in Mein Kampf, etc. We know how he feels. However, in the early years of taking power from 1933-34, he really does have very few concrete policies. And I think it's clear that actually he needs to consolidate his power first. He's coming into a Germany that has been, it's been through a very changing time over the last decade or two. We've had a Weimar government which has really promoted democracy. It's promoted kind of liberty and freedoms. And now he's trying to shut much of that down and switch much of that belief system into kind of almost the opposite. So it would be very difficult to come in and straight away be very open about those quite extreme and morally abhorrent practices and policies he wants to bring in. And therefore, before he can do that, he needs to consolidate his power first. He needs to rebuild the economy. He needs to create his terror state. He needs to do all those things before he can worry or deal with this other priority, perhaps of his, but not of Germany's right now. You can also then take this further as the time moves on, and the invasion of Poland is a huge debate in itself. If you're studying Edexcel, you should have quite a good understanding of all of the different interpretations behind why Poland was invaded. If it would be helpful for me to do a video on that, I can do, but you just let me know in the comments. We can start to apply this idea of racial policy as a priority to the events later on in the time period. So 1939 onwards, there is an argument to suggest that the invasion of Poland could have been driven by racial policy. His racial views about Slavic people, his racial views about Poles, and how he needs Lebensraum in the East, particularly in the USSR, and how he sees himself as far superior, far stronger, and absolutely capable of winning that war. So therefore, that's one reason why he invaded. That's an argument. It's not the only argument, not perhaps the right argument. It's an argument. As I already said, when he embarks on his war in Eastern Europe, we also see priorities starting to shift. The fact that he puts so much weight behind the Einsatzgruppen, he takes so many ordinary soldiers and puts them into these brigades, so much money and time spent on that shows that he's starting to prioritize racial policy. It's no longer just about conquest. There is something else behind it that's taking away his attention slightly. And then I think as the time period moves on into the final years of his rule, I think we really see racial policy start to take precedent. Now, you could argue that perhaps as everything else falls apart, it's one thing he grabs onto. He still feels in control of it. He still feels he can succeed in it. He feels he can accomplish something. But I think from this point, it really does take precedent in the way he runs his war and where he's putting his resources. Now, the next question I think we should address is, what evidence is there suggests that this was not planned? So starting from the early period, there are multiple exemptions. Jews who fought in the Great War were exempt from the earlier racial policies. That was Hindenburg, who primarily protected them. Many Jewish lawyers, Jewish doctors managed to work regardless of that legislation. Those laws are not really followed through on properly or to the same degree that we see later on. There's also a lack of clarity. We don't really quite understand Hitler's definitions at this point. The one-day boycott, for example, is a bit of a disaster in that regard. Nobody really knows what they're supposed to be doing. It only lasts for one day. It was supposed to last longer, but it's shut down. They're very wary of foreign opinion. Foreign opinion is clearly taking precedent. Trade and foreign relations clearly taking precedent at this point over racial policy. And then for the 1936 Olympics, the fact he completely backtracks on everything, taking down all the propaganda, all the posters, shows that there's no real consistent thrust here. Moving on, we also see the confusion over those early emigration policies, the economic role of emigration, where the Nazis realized they can essentially make money out of encouraging emigration or through forced emigration, and that being something they push for a while. Then they create and then shelve the Madagascar plan, all very kind of quickly and spontaneously. The use of general government suddenly as this dumping ground, and then deciding actually, no, should we shut down the ghettos and send people to Madagascar? It's just all quite confused. The role of the Einsatzgruppen for a while, and then that stopped as well, suggests maybe there wasn't really a clear thrust here. There was no prior thinking. Things just happen and react to circumstances as they come. Now, the third question would be for you to decide, when has Hitler consolidated his power by? When is he in a position to do as he wishes? I would argue that by 1937-38, he has resolved or created his terror state. He's fixed to a degree the German economy, at least outwardly. He has gone quite a long way in creating his new Germany, the social policies that he follows through on. And he's managed to reach a scenario where he's removed conservatives, he's removed those who were openly blocking his power, and he's created a terror state within which opposition has been effectively silenced. So I think by this date, he is able to shift his attention to racial policy. And I think that's exactly what we see with Kristallnacht. Now, again, you could come back to the suggestion that was Kristallnacht even Hitler's idea? Goebbels was really behind a lot of that, the thrust of that. Goebbels was the one who made the speech about it. So even this, for example, when he has consolidated his power, is it even him who makes the decision to go forward? Hitler's not involved with the Wannsee conference either. And I think that's another element of the debate. You know, how far was it just individuals within his very factional state who were seizing opportunities to promote themselves in Hitler's eyes, etc. Now, to end all confusion, what would I argue? So this is my opinion. This is what I would say, and I would argue. It doesn't have to be what you argue. I think there was a clear defined goal. I think the rhetoric, the writings, the speeches, Hitler's ideological position is obvious from the start. I think his character is also obvious from the start. And I don't think it's too much of a presumption to suggest that he's not the kind of person who would have allowed such a huge part of his thinking, his ideology, to go left at the side once he became such a powerful figure in Germany. However, I don't think policy is clear and consistent. I think he knew where he wanted to get to, but I don't think he really had a plan on how to reach it. I think racial policy is consistently secondary to other priorities in Germany and is not escalated based on a plan, but on what conditions of the time allowed. When they invaded Poland, they created general government. When they gained France and therefore Madagascar, they suddenly came up with the Madagascar Plan. When they needed money, they considered forced emigration with financial recuperation. And I just think that so much evidence falls into this category. I think at the end, so again, this is another time where you need to be very, very clear on your dates, because the dates dictate what you're talking about here. It could be how clear and consistent was policy from 33 to 42 to 39 to 45. You just need to be aware of it. If your question does go all the way to the end, I think at the end, as he begins to lose control of his state, then he prioritizes racial policy because it's the only thing left he can succeed in or achieve. And that's my opinion. Now, if you want me to pad that out a bit more, if you're interested in how I would evidence that, how I would really, argue the case with details and evidence, then do come along to one of the racial state lectures where I'm going to give you all the information that I would use and provide in an essay to go along with those key ideas, including the paragraphs I would write. Now, I'm not 100% clear on which of the two sessions I would put this particular essay question into at the moment. So if you're very keen on attending the one where I talk about this, then do just put that in your message. Use the link below, contact me via the contact box, tell me which ones you want to come to. Or if you just want to come to this, where I talk about this, and then I can get back to you and let you know which one of the two is most fitting.